So this recording is about the article co-written by Jeong and Grix entitled An Analysis of Japan's Soft Power Strategies Through the Prism of Sports Mega Events, published in Sport and Society in 2023. And we can observe, obviously, that this is an article co-written. The two scholars are collaborators of sorts. Grix is a more established professor at the University of Manchester, and Jeong, I believe, did his graduate studies with Grix. So this is likely part of the research emerging from his dissertation that is then being prepared for publication. And Grix is lending some of his credibility within this field of the study of mega events, or particularly sports mega events, in order to support this more junior scholar publishing this work and extending some of the ideas that he has been developing. We can also appreciate the ways that Jeong brings a particular kind of attention to the regional analysis of East Asia, and in particular Japan, and extends the work that Grix may have been able to do, but with in different kinds of contexts to that particular region. So we can also just appreciate some of the ways these kinds of co-authorship work and are able to take ideas to different kinds of socio-political contexts, to support scholars of different kind of disciplinary interests or regional interests, or at different points of their career. And that sometimes means that then these articles are able to be published in more reputable journals than when junior scholars are just trying to initially get some of their ideas out into the world. So this article was published in Sport and Society, which is a journal emerging in sports studies. In its description of itself, it just says that the vibrant growth in global academia's focus upon examining sports significance for modern society reflects social impacts on the intersecting domains of culture, identity, politics, governance, business, industry, communication, technology, and so on. Sport in Society is an international forum for academics and professionals to engage in these critical debates. Part of what the editors of this journal are interested in doing is advancing the understanding of key issues in professional and recreational sport, in physical education and exercise, in lifestyle and alternative sport, and coaching in social context. So we could imagine all of those conversations, also ones in which we could engage in our own research practices, as well as finding those connections around sports and performance and power. This is a journal that promotes multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. It's not surprising, we're seeing a lot of that in the research or in the articles that we're reading, and most likely in the kind of research that we'll be uptaking in the later part of the semester. Also, within this journal, there's an effort to acknowledge and value the research that is being conducted by professionals, so people who are not necessarily trained as academics, but that are practitioners of sorts, and that there's a recognition that very much complements academic studies of the dynamic relationship between sport and society. So we can perhaps understand that in a kind of practical way, but there are other kinds of journals in which case the kind of knowledge would not be deemed worthy of publication. So here in the kind of description of the journal, there's an explicit invitation and recognition of the value of that kind of perspective. The journal also has a commitment to promote studies of formerly or currently marginalized human groups and geographical regions. So it encourages submissions that address issues related to the Third World, post-colonial studies, gender, sexuality, development, peace, and social justice broadly defined. Again, making it explicit that there's a valuing of those kinds of contexts and those kinds of knowledges and issues emerging in those places or in those realms that perhaps have historically not been included in academic journals on sport and society. In order to keep the journal accessible to a wide audience, the editors do not take into consider highly specialized quantitative research that uses particular kinds of statistical analysis formulas. And I think that that's something really interesting to note as well, right? So again, we see this effort in this journal to be more legible to a broader audience and to disvalue some of the particular methodologies and forms of quantitative research that may not be as meaningful or as impactful for the broader kind of readership, if that includes not only academics, but professionals. And even within academics, there are many who probably work in sport and society who don't have the kind of literacy in reading those kinds of graphs or charts or data. And so this is not the journal for those researchers that are really interested in those kinds of forms of analysis and quantitative research. And then finally, this is a journal that publishes not only conventional scholarly articles around 10,000 to 12,000 words, but also commentaries that are shorter and things that may take the form of interviews, of research notes, or a policy recommendation. So the kind of real idea here is to really dig into these ideas of the intersections of sport and society, and less concern around some of the particular conventions of academic writing. There's a bit more variation, though of course we also see this example of academic writing in the article that we're engaging together. So I've selected this article to round out our shared readings for a few different reasons. One is because I think that it can be quite interesting to think through sports and other kinds of mega events or sports mega events in relation to issues of performance and power, because it, on one hand, can take us to thinking at a much bigger kind of scale, so beyond the individual actions or a kind of movement happening on social media or in a particular place. Here we can think about the kinds of performances that are happening with a lot of people involved, very big kinds of gatherings of sorts, and at the same time we can see interesting dynamics of guests and hosts playing out again here, sometimes in similar ways to those that Robinson has introduced to us, and sometimes in distinctly different kinds of ways. And so we can just see that that is a really rich area of inquiry to continue to be investigating as it relates to place. Right? And then as well, when we're thinking about the kind of scales of performance and considerations of power, certainly in relation to sports, we're invited to think about nationalism and the ways that a sense of belonging, a sense of pride can be cultivated through sports activities or other kind of mega events that have interesting kinds of ripple effects. And we see particular discussions of that in some of the latter sections in this article, where they're talking about the kind of public sentiment in the aftermath of the tsunami. And how there was a real kind of concerted effort to use this as an event to try to improve that kind of national affect. And when we're thinking about nation states and what it is to belong or not to a nation state, and to think about nationalism at the kind of the back end of that is some conversations that have emerged within scholarship since at least the 1980s around the idea of imagined community. So there is nothing that makes a nation state true, right, or fixed, right? This is always in flux. And so there are different kinds of theories as to how this kind of sense of nationalism is created and maintained and sustained. And that is very often through a kind of shared imagination of what it is to belong to that place and what it stands for, or what it is to belong to that nation state and what it what that nation state stands for. And so one of the scholars who's been influential in that teaching is named Benedict Anderson, and he was very interested in the role of newspapers, and he was doing his work on particular in Indonesia. But there's been a lot of conversation since then as newspapers have become less common in certain ways, less stabilizing force than they were at earlier moments of history. I'm thinking about other ways in which imagined communities are created and nationalism is produced. And so, again, this is just a very rich area in which to continue to do research and to be thinking about. And so it's something that you may be curious about and develop a research project around. The second major reason that I selected this article for our course at this time was because of the ways that it gives us a vocabulary of soft power and in distinction to hard power, which is also a very helpful kind of concept in which to be studying the dynamics of performance and power, especially with these kinds of, if we're thinking about nations and international relations, this becomes helpful language in terms of the actual theorization of power and understanding of how power circulates today. And the third reason that I've selected it is because I think that the organization of the article can be quite instructive for us as we work towards developing our proposals and then developing the research paper itself. So something that is done in quite clear ways in this article is the narrowing of a topic. So we have this kind of introduction to soft power. We have an introduction to the relationship of soft power as it's understood through mega events. And then we have an understanding of the relationship of soft power as it relates to sports mega events. And then we have the analysis of very particular kinds of sports mega events in East Asia, and then a kind of analysis of that, right? And so this narrowing, this understanding of connecting to broader fields of literature and scholarship, a recognition of what has been said there, but also what is missing there in terms of methodologies and in terms of the analysis of a particular place or a particular event, really drives forward the argument and the development of the research project. And we can this is a really helpful model for us as we're thinking about what it is we're going to try to do within the writing of a proposal and within our research project. There's also places where we can see particular kinds of helpful moves within orchestration of voices in the literature review that, again, I want to point you to. And as you'll be performing these kinds of moves in your own work, we can also look here to see the ways that a methodology is very explicitly named and very clearly named. And then also the kind of ways that the research is both executed and organized throughout the body of the paper. So there's a lot that we can learn from the kind of structures of this article, and in a way more so than some of the other articles we've read. I think it's very much, there's a lot of signposting, a lot of kind of demonstration of the kind of bones of academic writing that will be helpful to model in this class and in other classes as well. So, soft power. The article begins with a kind of brief sense of the context from which the study emerges, and particularly thinking through what was happening in terms of the balance of power towards the end of the Cold War, and this question of how do nations, and in particular East Asian nations, protect and further their national interests at this particular moment, after which there has been a kind of recalibration of the relations between the East and the West. There's a very clear focus on East Asian regionalism, and it's made explicit as well why that's the case, right? And so what I was just speaking to before, the kind of moves of academic writing, is that here a lot of these choices are made very explicit, and then that is kind of a very helpful for us to observe how that is done in these different kinds of spaces. Of importance to the understanding of this article, of course, is the distinction between hard power and soft power. So hard power pertains to things like economic sanctions, to military forces, and of those as being strategies in order to affect change in international relations. So we could certainly think of the war in the Ukraine right now, and both the kind of military force that is being active on both sides there, as well as the ways that the international community has responded to some extent with economic sanctions. This is all playing out in the spirit of hard power, right? We're then introduced at more length to the notion of soft power as it was developed by Nye and has been taken up by many other scholars interested in mega events and sports mega events, as well as other kinds of cultural mega events, world fairs, biennials. There could be consideration of soft power with like the Cannes Film Festival, right? There's other kinds of mega events and ways in which soft power operates as well. And this kind of definition that Nye offers us is around, to describe soft power, has to do with a nation's ability to foster an attraction that makes others want what you want, right? So as opposed to being kind of more blunt or explicit in the terms of hard power, this is about a politics of attraction, an effort to co-opt and to foster a kind of shared sensibility rather than to use coercive mechanisms. And very often those kinds of intangible assets that are within the cultural sphere become very useful in order for creating situations in which soft power can be exercised. And so that can be in the realm of cultural exchanges and diplomacy, and other kinds of situations where attractive ideologies are staged, and perhaps different kinds of audiences, either from within the nation state or from outside of it on regional or more broad international scales, come into contact and are somewhat, seduced and intrigued by what it is that's happening there. And so we can think about something that soft power cannot be purchased, right? It's not necessarily possible to develop that in the same way. It's more reputational. It has to do with a kind of affect. It has to do with a kind of experience. And that, so we could think about food, cultures, and cultural performances, whether they're traditional or developed more recently. They can be fictional, of course, right? Or they may have historic roots. So all of these kinds of things, but we can see that as a really realm, a rich realm in which soft power can be acquired. And so it can be that there's a lot of investment, financial investment, and other kinds of investment in terms of time and priorities, in terms of creating opportunities for soft power to be exercised, but it can't explicitly be acquired through financial exchange. And so this is the kind of intellectual realm in which the authors are drawing from. They're engaging this kind of scholarship that has spoken to soft power in theoretical terms, and then they narrow that to then thinking about the sports mega events, and then sports mega events, and then East Asians' use of sports mega events, right? And so we see this very clear narrowing of focus, but it's supported and situated in this much broader field of study. I'm going to draw your attention to paragraph 3 because this paragraph does a lot of helpful work in terms of setting up what it is that will follow, and it's a good model of the kind of paragraph that you could aspire towards writing in your proposal in your final paper. We can notice a couple things. One is that there's a lot of signposting and a kind of effort to really speak to the reader to make it very clear what is happening and what intentional choices, the kind of choices that have been made, are being made explicit. And so the structure of this article is as follows, right? This is a signal to say, pay attention. I'm going to tell you how to read this, right? First, we present a literature review on soft power in East Asia before turning to literature on Japan, soft power, and sport, right? So here are these 2 steps. You'll be able to follow those and feel supported in knowing what's to come. The following section introduces the methodology, including an overview of the tripartite approach to the analysis of Japan's rationale for hosting the 1964 Olympics and the current 2021 Summer Olympics, which consist of a focus on domestic, regional, and international motives for hosting, right? So this introduction, and by virtue of saying next we're doing this, but they're already giving us a sense as well as to like what it is that they're doing there. So underscoring or preparing us to really pay attention to this idea of the tripartite approach, and just an overview of the kind of two of the case studies they're going to be looking at. Such an approach, informed by the author's previous work on state soft power packages, offers a more nuanced understanding of state soft power strategies used by Japan. So already a kind of claim as to what is being offered that is novel and important. And that's that there's a more nuanced understanding of the state's soft power strategies used by Japan, in part because of this tripartite approach that they are using as their methodology. While a number of commentators have focused on either domestic, regional, or mostly international levels of soft power and its use, the contribution of this piece, right, so making it really bold and underlined, is to bring all of these levels together in a tripartite approach, offering a clearer understanding of Japan's rationale for hosting sports mega events across historical contexts. Right, so there's a signposting of what's to come, but also a presupposing of the argument and a presupposing of what will be the major abstraction and takeaway that will have relevance for other kinds of contexts. And it's like the reason why someone should read this article, right, is that this tripartite approach is a useful methodology, and it's one that offers clearer understanding and more nuanced understanding of the rationale for, in particular, Japan hosting sports mega events across historical contexts, but also by implication that this kind of tripartite approach could be used for studies in different kinds of regional contexts or for other kinds of mega events. So within a short period, there's a lot happening here, and this is the kind of density with which you're going to aspire to in your writing of the proposal and your final paper. That everything here is very intentional, and that a lot of thought has gone into the kind of organization of the work, and thinking through what is it that can be said at this point in order to really prime the reader for what will later follow. So we have this kind of helpful organization in the piece, right? The literature review on soft power that leads into the analysis of sports soft power, and the literature review on the sport and soft power in East Asia. This kind of flow is also something that you could attend to, of thinking what's the widest kind of field, and then what are some more focused things that are the pillars upon which I am building my own research inquiry. Within those moves, there's a couple examples of orchestrating voices that I wanted to draw your attention to. So the first, sports studies were late in drawing on the concept of soft power to explain how sports mega events can be used as part of a state's public diplomacy armory. So within, so that's a kind of a claim, but it's one that's secured by 3 scholars, including Grix, one of the co-authors of this piece. So there's a fairly high level of confidence in that claim, even though we could understand it needing, by virtue of what is being said, of it needing to be kind of thoroughly, someone to have a thorough understanding of sports studies in order to make that claim, right? And so that by calling sports studies as late in drawing attention to the concept of soft power, right, that requires a kind of understanding of both what was happening in sports studies and also how the concept of sports power, of soft power, was emerging at the time. None of the earlier commentators in sports studies offered any mechanisms or ideal types by which soft power could be understood, right? So again, this is a fairly, it's phased in a very definitive kind of way. And so it's one that would require having been very studied in terms of sports studies and the ways in which soft power had been addressed there, right? So we can understand that there's been a pretty thorough literature review that's been undertaken in order to substantiate that kind of claim, and that it relates to, that's also part of the reason why there's multiple citations that are securing that first sentence. A second example of orchestrating voices I want to draw your attention to is a bit longer, so I'll read it now. Increasingly, it appears self-explanatory that any state should seek to host a sports mega event to grow their soft power. However, this tends to overlay the range of different reasons why states invest in sports mega events. For example, the growing literature developing around sports diplomacy highlights the icebreaker role sport can play in easing previously strained international relations, exemplified by several high-profile cases of the so-called ping-pong diplomacy between China and the USA during 1971, and an attempt to repeat its success through baseball diplomacy between the US and Cuba. Such examples point to the formal, traditional, and high-level state-led sports diplomacy, but do not capture the newer, more network versions of unconventional sports diplomacy by a wide variety of actors. Equally, as these two authors suggest, there is a clear need to distinguish between levels of diplomacy that is domestic, regional, and national. It is this more nuanced approach that the present study seeks to pursue. So we can see here a really strong example of a literature review and the orchestration of voices, where there's a clear kind of agenda that the authors of this text have, and that is, of course, pointing to and justifying the need for their tripartite approach. And so I've highlighted some of the kinds of places in which they're doing the work of making those transitions to build that sentiment explicit. And of course, it's also, necessary to note the ways that they've included all of the citations to substantiate these claims, right? So, we can feel like there's a kind of journey and the road isn't exactly straight, but we're very much being guided, right? So it appears this way, however, right, let's turn our direction and then let's go down that trail with this example. And then let's understand those examples. And then we'll say equally important is to hold on to this and then to look at these kinds of ways here, right? And so there's a really intentional kind of development of the argument happening here. And it's one that is really deeply informed by the existing literature, and that literature review, or what we will call the state of knowledge, feeds into, it points us right to this kind of knowledge gap, which is this kind of tripartite approach to understanding why states seek to host sports mega events, and that is a more nuanced approach that is going to be tried out here. So the existing literature leads us to the knowledge gap, and that creates the need for this current research. It justifies the need for this research, or it explains why this research is happening. Okay, so in the methodology section, this is also a helpful section to pay attention to as you're tasked then in the proposal for actually making explicit your own kind of methodology. We have a clear statement of intention. So the aim of this article is to contribute an understanding of non-sporting use of sports mega events in East Asia, namely China, Japan, and South Korea, right? So they're not really used in like what actually happens within the sports, but of the ways in which that sports mega event does other kinds of things in relation to power. And we also have another kind of definition and explanation and emphasis around the tripartite approach. So from previous work on states development of a soft power package, that is the components that make up a state's soft power strategies, the authors have found that most analyses dealing with sports mega events focus on one or two aspects of the tripartite approach, but do not analyze the domestic, regional, and international levels of soft power acquisition, right? So again, the kind of intervention that is at the methodological scale is one that comes from observation of what has been said before. And the final thing that I just wanted to say here, that it may be helpful for other kinds of research projects, but that emerges from a recognition of the value of the tripartite approach here, is that this basic understanding that any event, any act, any performance, any spectacle, any mega event is doing different things for different audiences, right? And that when we, in your research projects, it may not be that you're trying to hold a lot of space for that multiplicity of different audiences and audience experiences, but that if that's not the focus of your study, it may still be helpful to acknowledge it at a particular time and to think about what are other ways this performance could be interpreted, or what are other ways that this performance may be doing something to a different kind of audience member than the one that I am thinking through in the most length here, right? So we cannot presume a kind of homogeneity of our audiences or in terms of the performance. It's much easier to study the performance than it is to speak about audience uptake, because actually that's a very, very difficult thing to research. There's a whole field of kind of audience studies or reception studies that tries to think through those dynamics. That data set is quite difficult to come to. So I think that just this article kind of reminds us of those complexities and reminds us not to take for granted what we think audiences are taking away from any given performance, and that in fact there can be many different kinds of takeaways for different audiences and at different kinds of levels as well. Okay, and so finally, I think that the body of the paper is relatively accessible in terms of its language. We can appreciate that the body of the research is organized in very kind of supportive ways with the use of headers. You're certainly able to use headers in your own writing of your research papers. They should be descriptive for the most part, so in relation to what the content of that section is about. We can kind of also appreciate the ways that the intention of this project to look at these different regimes at the domestic level, the regional level, the international level are kind of like consistently looked at in each of the case studies, and that where it's very clear what is happening, what level we're looking at that time, and that when we look at those, that all three, it leads to a kind of greater complexity of an understanding of the event. within each of those sections, there's the interweaving of primary and secondary research. So sometimes within more kinds of scientific writing or social science writing, there's a effort to kind of separate the primary data and the results from the discussion of those results. Here we see that all kind of bleeding and informing each other. And so those are just differences of disciplinary conventions. It's more often the case in the humanities that that's going to be interwoven. But again, this is one of those places where you're going to need to be attentive to the conventions of the disciplines in which you're working, either by just observing other kinds of writing within that field of study or by asking your professor for their advice. In the conclusion, we'll likely return to looking at the conclusion when we start to think about writing conclusions for our own research paper as well, because this conclusion helps us to models the ways that abstractions can be highlighted in a conclusion, where again, our attention is directed to the tripartite analysis and what it can offer. We're given a summary of the findings, and within that summary, there's a little bit more of an amalgamation of the 3 levels of the case study and the ways that does indeed offer a kind of more complex understanding of what was happening during those specific sports mega events in Japan. And then finally, we can look at the last sentence to see kind of what it is that the authors are trying to do there. So this study builds on and extends the growing literature on the use of sport in the acquisition of soft power and image enhancement, right? So they're making it very explicit what they are, where they're situated within ongoing scholarly conversations, right? Who will care about this article? And they're building on what's been said and they're extending it, right? Although still at an early stage, the systematic analysis of domestic, regional, and international soft power in one study allows a finer grain analysis of state strategies to seek influence without the recourse to hard power. Too many studies simply equate the hosting of sports mega events with the acquisition of soft power without an understanding of the variety of motives at different levels that this masks. Right? They're saying that there needs to be more attention to the variety of motives, and that means that requires a different kind of methodological approach. The tripartite approach can be extended to other sports mega event hosts, as long as it is embedded within the wider economic, social, and geopolitical context of the case being studied. So this is really the major takeaway in this article. Of course, it has to do with an understanding of what was like actually happening for Japan within these situations, but really the major abstraction, the thing that it will be most useful for other scholars, is the kind of methodology that is being tried out here, and that methodological approach can be used in other sports mega event situations. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about this article, and please check out the other instructions on the module to see what else to do to prepare for class. See you soon.